People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Box Day. We asked the people, do you think a war has been waged on motorists? Here's a taste of what they had to say.
It certainly is in Nottingham. Nottingham is very anti-car.
Fearless words from the man in Nottinghamshire. State of the Nation starts now. Also be hearing from our acclaimed panel, British farmer and former Conservative MP Neil Parish and former editor of Labour List Peter Edwards. As ever, I want to hear from you, so please get in touch by emailing mailmog@gbnews.uk. But before all of that, it's been another busy day, and here to keep us up to date is Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. The top story tonight on GB News, Rishi Sunak and the Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama have vowed to work together to tackle illegal migration. Following talks at Downing Street, a joint statement says the two Prime Ministers have agreed to deepen the relationship between the two countries, to cooperate on trade, investment and address global threats. It added that Mr Sunak welcomes the Albanian community to British life. That's after Mr Rama criticised the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, for referring to some people from his country as criminals, comments he branded as disgraceful. Speaking after the talks, he denied many of the migrants in the UK are from Albania.
There's a lot of confusion and there is also a lot of speculation
about the data, because it's not simply not true that all these people come from Albania. This is theoretically impossible, arithmetically impossible, and factually not true. They are Albanians that come also from other countries, mainly Greece.
The Northern Ireland Secretary has told Stormont leaders there's no negotiating the Windsor framework and that it will become law. Chris Heaton-Harris has been holding talks over the Prime Minister's post-Brexit trade deal at Hillsborough Castle. That's after a key element of the EU-UK agreement, known as the Stormont Break, was overwhelmingly passed in the Commons yesterday. Well, the DUP leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, described the Windsor framework as a sticking plaster that won't work, which the Northern Ireland Secretary disputed. Parliament has banned the Chinese-owned social media app TikTok from all government devices. It follows security concerns from the House of Commons and Lords, but won't include personal devices. Scotland has followed suit, with its Deputy First Minister saying the ban will be implemented immediately. And that comes as TikTok's chief executive has faced questions in the United States Congress over data security and user safety. The Labour leader has today released the amount of tax he's paid on his income and capital gains in the last 2 years. Sir Keir Starmer says he's paid £118,580 in tax since the start of 2021. That's after the Prime Minister published his tax documents yesterday, which showed he paid more than £1 million in tax over the last 3 years. And lastly, the Bank of England has raised the interest rate for the 11th time in a row from 4% to 4.25%. That's in a bid to slow down the rising cost of living. The central bank also announced it expects the economy to grow slightly in the second quarter, revising a previous forecast that it would contract. Those are your latest news stories. You are up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on the TuneIn app. You're with GB News, the People's Channel. Time to go back to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Yesterday, we revealed a newly discovered affliction of the brain known as Borris spongiform encephalopathy, which particularly affects Islington residents. But today, we can reveal another plague outbreak that this country has suffered from, the occult of the expert with their voodoo charms. In recent decades, the democratic arm has handed things over to the bureaucratic arm. The idea that experts will do things fairly and properly and they don't need the supervision of people who are held to account by voters. We saw this with the European Union. We still see it with the ECHR. We saw it with SAGE during the pandemic, which locked us down more than we discover we now needed. And we see it every 6 months with the Office for Budget Responsibility. But perhaps most seriously, we see it with the Bank of England, the old lady of Threadneedle Street. And the Bank of England now benefits from the constitutional concept that the king can do no wrong. The Bank of England is thought to be so above politics and so wise and good that the raising of the eyebrow of the governor of the Bank of England will set us always on a straight course, keep us on the straight and narrow, make our economy grow and work. And yet we've had 11 consecutive rises in interest rates with inflation at over 10%. Now, the Bank of England has one job. That is to keep inflation at 2%, plus or minus 1%. It has to write a billy-do to the Chancellor of the Exchequer if it misses that target. And it has bungled this very basic task. Its essential task it has not got right. And the reason for that is that it hasn't paid attention to the growth in the money supply since it started with quantitative easing as a very sensible response to the economic crash of 2008. But instead of beginning to normalise interest rates in the mid-20-teens, it kept them at falsely inflated levels, and this has built up an excess of money in the system, and we all know that money must find a home. And one of the homes it finds is in higher prices. And they pumped in even more money during COVID, lower interest rates, more quantitative easing, funding government debt. And this has led, as night follows day, to inflation. This is not something that surprises economists. Economists know that if you pump money out, eventually it will feed through to prices. And now they've had to slam the brakes on very harshly. And this has a real effect. It has a real effect in two ways. First of all, of course, inflation is damaging economically. It is a tax on the poor, and it is a tax on the retired and those with savings. Those in work will catch up with their wages eventually, but those on fixed incomes lose out particularly, and the least well off are the most hit by it. But it also hits those as interest rates spike who have mortgages. So those who are aspirational, trying to do their bit, trying to improve their standard of living, buying their own home, upgrading their house, have been caught by this increase in interest rates, and people who are thinking of buying their own home, who thought they'd got their own personal budget in a situation where they could afford to buy their own home, are caught out. And this has been because not just of the Bank of England, but central banks generally suffering from groupthink. They thought they were so clever that they could trump historic rules of economic outcomes and likelihood. And they suffered from no democratic control. They felt that they could do whatever they liked and the politicians would take the blame. Well, we don't believe that here on GB News. We believe the people know best, which is why we're always asking you for your views. Voice of the people is the voice of God. So please get in touch, which is what we always want you to do, at mailmog@GBNews. Give me your views and I will read them out. But I'm very pleased to be joined this evening by the financial journalist Laurie Laird. Laurie, thanks so much for coming in. It's very good of you. Why has the Bank of England got it so wrong, and why has it had to slam the brakes on so abruptly?
But the Bank of England has it wrong in so many areas, and I think it's a little bit unfair to criticize just the Bank of England. Central bankers all over the place have got it wrong, and Jerome Powell, you've heard of him, he's first amongst equals amongst central bankers. He's head of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Last summer, he actually said in public, I now know how much I don't understand about inflation. And that sort of humility is lovely from a public figure, but that's panicky. That's a little bit scary that the world's leading central banker didn't get inflation. But we've looked at, for so many months after the pandemic, when inflation started to rise, what was the response? Don't worry about it, transitory. We could raise interest rates, but that won't make energy prices lower. That won't produce more semiconductors. We heard that for a long time. Then inflation wasn't transitory. Now we see that we hear a lot about a wage price spiral. We have to raise interest rates very, very quickly so people don't want higher wages to keep up with inflation. But now we have a new message that no one can quite figure out. So we had higher interest rates today, but the hint that maybe rates aren't going higher again. That's difficult to sell if your mandate is to keep inflation at 2% and inflation's in fact at 10%.
Well, I agree with you that it's not just the Bank of England. It goes back a long time, doesn't it? It goes back to the Greenspan idea that the Federal Reserve could bail the American economy out of every passing financial storm that Greenspan put. And that led to the Federal Reserve pumping money into the system at the slightest sneeze of markets. And markets just got used to that, and they got used to easy money.
Absolutely, markets got used to easy money, but we also have something else going on. We have central bank. This allowed governments to run much bigger deficits. They have printed a lot of treasury bonds all over the place. A lot of institutions are sitting on this, and one of the big potential risks of instability we have now is the price of those as inflation rises. As inflation rises, the yields on these things rise, the price goes down, and we have institutions that are sitting on big losses.
And this is really important because you've got in pension funds the mark-to-market rule, and they will be taking these losses annually as they produce their accounts. But the regulators told them that they had to buy gilts, bonds in other countries, because they argued that that met their liabilities, and therefore they couldn't grow to pay the pensions. They had to buy an asset that is really eaten into by inflation and higher interest rates.
But these were meant to be the safest thing that you could possibly buy. What we've seen in the U.S., where we've seen these bank failures, is banks didn't mark to market, as you say. They assumed they would hold these to maturity. So the price of these very, very safe assets is starting to fall. This is where we could see vulnerabilities in the financial system. And one of the reasons the Bank of England said we could pause, the Federal Reserve said it last night, is they are concerned about financial stability. They are concerned about what may be lurking in the banking system.
And when we had the problem in the UK market in September after the mini budget with the LDIs, actually the Bank of England had a huge conflict of interest because it lost over £1 billion, 20% of its pension fund, because it had taken on risky LDIs without realising the risk. So you've got regulators, central banks, not even realising the risks they're taking, let alone in the wider economy.
Here's the most remarkable thing about that incident, and we can look back on the mini-budget era, and it's almost like a bad dream. We've almost forgot about it. And lucky for the UK, so have investors. It's remarkable that the UK isn't paying a risk premium for all of that. But yields on all maturities, say 30 years, are below where they were on September 22nd. We've got a bit of a free ride here that we're not being charged a risk premium, not only because of what happened then, but we do have potential political instability coming. We're not that far away from an election.
And you've got the terrible conundrum that the Bank of England was wrestling with today and the Federal Reserve yesterday, and in the Federal Reserve announcement they indicate this, that they need to tighten rates further to deal with inflation, but they need to loosen them to deal with the risk of a financial crisis, and they don't actually know what to do.
They do. It doesn't feel like they know what to do. It hasn't felt like they've known what to do throughout. It feels a little bit like they're fighting inflation, or they were, until this financial instability came. But they're fighting inflation with the old rule book. They're looking at the 70s. They're talking about this wage price spiral, which again is keeping people from asking for raises to keep up with inflation. But we're not in the 1970s right now. We don't have as much collective bargaining. You're not setting wages across a full economy. But you said something in your monologue I wanted to ask you about. You talked about central banks perhaps not having enough accountability. And I think that's a really good question. How do you do that? Could you make central banks be accountable to politicians and still have a good outcome?
Well, until 1997, the Bank of England was not independent. And there was the famous Ken and Eddie show when the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England would have a discussion. It was all very public. So that if the government was adjusting interest rates for political reasons, the Bank of England was saying, hold on a minute. And it led to an accountable solution with the Bank of England giving advice, but the politicians deciding.
But I might argue that's the good chap theory, and that may work, but it's not guaranteed to always work.
Well, no system always works.
Fair enough. And as it was coming out of my mouth,
except potentially the old Bundesbank, which was absolutely focused on inflation and nothing else. And it's the mixed instructions to central banks that led to the Greenspan put and have led to the confusion over what they're actually trying to do. If they're focusing on sound money, then that's a job they can actually do.
Bundesbank is a little bit different, though, because it had one mandate, and that was inflation, where the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, full employment and fighting inflation. The Bank of England would say, we also have a dual mandate, fighting inflation and financial stability, because the Bank of England's the ultimate regulator of banks as well.
And therefore this has led to a degree of confusion. Thank you so much for coming in. Your expertise is much appreciated. Don't forget to let me know what you think. If your mortgage is going up, mailmog@gbnews.uk. Coming up, it's utter madness. Oxford socialist-led council is banning all animal products from town hall events. For everyone. I'll be discussing why it's an awful idea.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GBNews. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. So Sarah says, what do you suggest the best investment solutions are in these current financial times? As a Swiss, I don't trust banks anymore. I think I'm not allowed to give investment advice for all sorts of good and wise regulatory reasons, so I won't go into that. But Elizabeth says, it looks as if Miss Truss and her Chancellor were toppled by the bank because she had implied she would reform them. That's a very fair point. I don't think they like the thought of any reform. Anyway, a Labour-run city council sparked fury after they banned all meat products from meetings, instead forcing plant-based options on town hall events. Oxford City Council's decision followed a unanimous vote. It's been branded a knee-jerk reaction and a kick in the teeth for farmers, which I quite like. I don't know how far your knee has to go up to kick somebody in the teeth, but leaving that to one side, the motion was proposed by Labour Party councillor Paula Dunn, following in the footsteps of Oxfordshire City Council, which became the first authority to do so in December 2021. The council unanimously voted in favour of following the county council's lead by ensuring that food provided for internal council events are entirely plant-based. I'm delighted to be joined now by Caris Bennett, who is the Corporate Projects Manager at PETA. Caris, thank you for joining us this evening. I imagine you're in favour of what Oxford City Council has done.
It's absolutely wonderful that this was a unanimous vote for all food served to be vegan. But they aren't the first council to have done so. You mentioned Oxfordshire County Council, but there's also been Lewisham, there's been Exeter, there's been town councils, county councils. Also, Helsinki doesn't serve meat or dairy at council functions. Amsterdam City Council has gone veggie. There is so much action all around the world because we know the climate impact of farming animals for food is tremendous. Up to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from animal farming. So it's time that all councils started doing this all around the world.
All right, but wasn't there a council that Wasn't there a council that did this and they had to throw away all their food because everyone thinks it's disgusting and they like a bit of meat and they like a bit of butter and they like a bit of cream?
Well, sometimes traditions can be hard to change, but we've absolutely got to grasp this. We're running out of time. The United Nations is urging a shift to plant-based diet. So this is something councils
But shouldn't you allow people choice? Don't you want to allow people choice and freedom and, you know, I enjoy foie gras and I enjoy cream and I want to eat these things, that they're delicious and they provide a good economy for our farmers?
Well, councillors can choose what to eat in their own homes and when they go to cafes and restaurants, of course. But at council meetings, the council has climate action plans. They have goals to reduce their carbon footprint. And we know that eating a vegan diet can reduce your carbon footprint of food by 73%. It's really important, and if councils are going to act on their goals, they should all be doing this.
What? But why should we force people to eat horrible food? I mean, my children don't like their vegetables to start with, and I sympathise with them. What people want is to eat meat and dairy products, which are absolutely delicious, and support so much of our agricultural industry, which is becoming greener and greener with modern farming methods.
It's not all salads nowadays. There's a certain vegan sausage roll that's available everywhere. And more farmers
that sounds
are now
so horrible.
Plant-based farming. There has been a real big change, and it's continuing to happen with farmers growing things like oat to make oat milk. They're growing beans and pulses in order to have vegan burgers made from pea protein, made from wheat protein, and it is so much better for the environment.
OK, but one final thing. If you're a vegan, why do you want to pretend you're eating a sausage roll?
Well, I grew up eating meat, and most people did, so people want to eat what's familiar to them. And actually, when places like Burger King have a vegan burger, as they're doing now, and McDonald's, that is saving the suffering and stopping, you know, hundreds of thousands of animals from being bred and being killed and dying an agonising death in the slaughterhouse. So if that's going to help animals prevent climate change and be healthier for people, it's a win-win all round.
Well, I'm not sure I'm convinced, but Caris, thank you so much. Caris Bennett of Peter there. Now we've had our green Peter and we have our red Peter, but I prefer my steak blue. Peter.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for coming on again. Do you think this is a reasonable thing for councils to do, or they should just allow people choice?
I think it's reasonable. I gave up meat 20 years ago, although I'm not a fully fledged vegan, so personally I've got a lot of sympathy for it. As your previous guest said, people living in Oxford and Oxfordshire can still buy, shop and dine wherever they like and eat whatever they like, so I don't think it limits choice. But I'd actually make a broader point, which is cast your mind back 20 or 30 years. Labour councils did lots of other things that were described as a loony left, whether that was around black rights or about things like congestion charges and creating disincentives against car usage. They were called mad 20 or 30 years ago, and now there's a broader degree of public acceptance for them.
Well, I think the anti-motorist war is absolutely mad now. I haven't changed my view on that at all.
But I'm sure you'd agree with a much greater push for black rights as we had in the 80s.
Queen Victoria led the way in being anti-racist, actually, if you look at her behaviour, and that's long before Labour councils were doing it. Neil, come on, you're a farmer. Yes. You can't possibly want to be limited in what you can sell as a farmer.
No, I think it is a matter of choice and then good local food. I mean, I probably should declare an interest. I've got Devons, Herefords, Lincoln Reds. They graze on permanent pasture. That holds the carbon in the soil. You produce a very good red meat that fattens on grass. What is better than that? You've got milk and cheese, as you rightly say, all produced locally. I mean, you take almond milk, for instance. It's hugely bad for the environment, travels miles before we get here. So I think, you know, give people choice, and if they have a choice, I have a niece who's a vegetarian, and I say, Sophie, it's great the vegetables, but I could do with just a little bit of meat with it. And I think, you know, this is the issue. If people want to have and you see, the carbon that's held in permanent pasture is the same as you capture by 20 years of growing trees. And I think people forget this. And if you've got good permanent pasture, you've got greater biodiversity, we can actually, as you say, we are producing policies now which we're farming in a greener way. So give people choice, let them have some meat and dairy if they choose to do so. Why is it when there's a majority of people in this country that still eat meat and dairy products, are councils basically banning you from having that at meetings?
And that's the point, isn't it, Peter, that people do still like eating meat, that councils are there to reflect the people who elect them, and that you may think it's very good not to eat meat. It may be very virtuous, I wouldn't happen to agree, but should you enforce your virtue on other people?
I do accept that the role of politicians is to show leadership rather than just ape or imitate my own views. But I think the council is showing leadership, and I think it can still stimulate the farming community and the rural economy. Yeah, you know, we have a lot of arable farming. Neil will know a lot more about it than I do. Of course, farmers can make a huge contribution to a vegan diet and continue to do so. So I think the idea that just a small number of meetings that one might be fortunate enough to attend, that you don't have a pork pie, I don't think there's a direct line to the collapse of British farming.
Where Neil and I are in Somerset, if you took away the dairy industry, the land would not be farmed. It's not going to be turned over to arable, is it? Yeah, I mean, you're much more
You see, the thing is that you take the west of the country, right from Scotland, right down through north of England, Wales, into the West Country. Most of it is permanent pasture. That is not. You don't actually, with the biodiversity, we don't actually want that land to be ploughed up. A lot of it shouldn't be ploughed up anyway. And so therefore it produces a very good grass that then creates a very good protein for us to eat. And I think, if you look at the amino acids that we need in our bodies, some of the vegan diets are very difficult to get those final amino acids that we need. And I think, you don't have to eat a lot of meat, but I think eating meat, I'm probably an example.
I want to eat a lot of meat,
I'm an example.
Much.
You can see by my physique that Jacob, I do eat a little meat and I do eat a little food. But seriously, I think, if we want to actually keep people healthy, then I think some red meat, chicken, all of these things, along with vegetables. I don't go to war with people who want to be vegans and want to be vegetarians. But for goodness sake, let's be realistic that we need those livestock to keep our countryside in the way
isn't that
we
right,
want it.
That we are actually omnivores and therefore people need to eat meat. It's part of our diet since the beginning of mankind.
Well, it's part of our diet in the West. I suspect there are people in other cultures in the Far East who might take a different view. And I also want to pick up on some of Neil's points. I think there's a danger that we use some kind of language of Armageddon. We're not at war with each other, and one or two councils...
But you are when you had quite a long answer. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
One or two councils taking meat... literally off the agenda for their meetings, I don't think is a major issue. You can still get a pork pie or a roast beef any way you like in Oxfordshire. So choice thrives.
Well, thank you both very much. I will still be having my roast beef for Sunday lunch. Still ahead, it turns out that the BBC pays Gareth Linklater the equivalent salary to the entire budget of their soon-to-be shut-down BBC Singer's Choice. Isn't this utter screwloosery? I will see you in just enough time to eat one of Mr. Kipling's exceedingly fine cakes.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now? Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your mail mogs. Now, Jilly, you win the prize for this evening. I must tell my children this. I think they will like this point. Apparently, vegetarians and vegans produce 70% more methane than meat eaters. I wonder where that goes. Carter, who clearly enjoys a pun, says it sounds like a load of tripe to me. James, we should have meat-only meals to compensate for the lack of being eaten. And Frank said, it tastes fake. Bring out the Somerset cheddar and the Melton Mowbray pork pie. Now, a few weeks ago, the BBC, Auntie, announced it was going to axe the BBC Singers Choir owing to a tightening of their belts. However, it's also been revealed that our friend Gary Lineker, a singular human, just one person, earns more than the entire budget of the choir and the salaries of its 21 members. Anyway, the really interesting news is that the Cabinet is backing a campaign set up to reverse the BBC's decision to axe the choir and the jobs of its members. And I think this is a really important thing that's happening. I'm obviously an impartial presenter for this part of the show, and I have a feeling that my distinguished panel may agree. But Peter, how can the BBC justify the licence fee if it doesn't do these essential cultural objectives, fulfil them, that other people wouldn't do? The commercial world wouldn't fill this. If the BBC is cutting its cultural things and adjusting its commercial things, can it justify a licence fee?
The licence fee can always be justified, but I think axing the choristers is a grievous misstep, whether that's because of the rich and illustrious choral tradition in Britain going back several centuries, even back to medieval monks, or in the context of pay today. And someone like me, who loves choral music but also loves football, still feels that the pay is far too high. I would cap all BBC pay 100 grand, no higher, and while I love football, if that means having a different presenter to save the choristers, I'm all for it.
Neil?
Yeah, I think on this occasion we will all agree, because I think commercially sport can be dealt with. When it comes to choristers, not only is it the BBC choir, but it's the impact it has across all other choirs. I mean, my wife sings in a local choir. I mean, the singing that we've got in this country needs support. And as soon as the BBC takes that away, then other choirs probably will struggle. And I think this is a real problem because, you know, we have to pay the BBC license, you know, the license in order to watch BBC. And when you think of the sort of the culture and the people that are actually watching the BBC, I think you'll find they really would want to see that choral music.
But do you think the Cabinet should be intervening in this, or is it a matter that the government's got enough to do, it's got Northern Ireland protocols to deal with, and it shouldn't be interfering in the day-to-day activities of the BBC?
Well, I think, the BBC is a special animal, isn't it, really? It's sort of, and I think government, because there's a public licence fee, I think government and Cabinet will be inclined to actually say, is this the right decision for the BBC? I mean, they've got various politicians got involved in the Gary Lineker thing in the first place. I was commenting on GB News a week or two ago about it. And I think, that's why I think the Cabinet's, if they choose to do so, and I think a lot of people would actually support that, because in the end, we want to see this beautiful music. We want to be able to get other choirs to join in with the BBC and beyond, really.
And Peter, you mentioned that there's this great tradition of it. And of course, you're absolutely right that the Chapel Royal, Queen Elizabeth I, subsidised a chapel. Choral music was very important, and it's fascinating how it survived the Reformation when some of the more hardline Protestants were very against it. And so the tradition of public funding for choral music is very strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And it picks up another point, which is public participation. And there is a dotted line between funding and participation. To give you one quick example, I grew up in the 1980s with cricket on free-to-air. It was taken off free-to-air, went onto a satellite channel. The coverage has been very good, but since 2005, the last terrestrially screened series, participation has declined over 20 years. So it's entirely foreseeable, therefore, that choral participation will decline as well. And that will be to the detriment of the social fabric.
And it's not only participation, but it's also training for young singers who have passed through the BBC, and that enriches the whole of the musical talent of the United Kingdom.
Yes, and there is a place for Geordie Shore and Bad Dogs, Borstal and everything else. But there's
you
also...
know more about that than I do.
Well, I suspect I don't, but that might be one area where we are on the same page. Not too many. But there's a place for the whole cultural spectrum. And actually, the choristers, in terms of the BBC budget, I mean, quick back of the fag packet maths, the amount of money they consume from the BBC budget is well below 0.1%.
Neil, I want to come back to your point, because you were saying it is right for the government to intervene, but don't you think it's in the minutiae, and that the government really ought to focus on the big issues, and that it's right for us to discuss it, and it's right for newspapers to take it up, but it's not the duty of the government to say how the BBC spends 1.2 billion of its 5.5 billion income?
Except that the public can't have really any say about how their BBC fee is spent. And so therefore, in a way, the government is the minder, if you like, of that money. And I think it is right for them to be able to say something. I think, you talked about, Elizabeth I actually, she was the one that actually saved choral music, because otherwise we wouldn't have it now in our churches and beyond. And I think, it's key. And I think, let's actually get the BBC to wake up and realise that, in the arts, in choral music, you actually need support. And that is, I started off my life in local council, and even the art centres and all those things always needed support, even if sometimes I was considered a Philistine and didn't want to spend it. On the other hand, I think it's right they do. And I do actually think on this occasion, I may gently disagree with you, is that I think it's fine for government to actually say to the BBC, think again on what you're doing, because, you made the point. £1 million for Gary Lineker, and yet, cut the choral music.
And I just don't understand how this fits with the licence fee. That if you are taxpayer funded, surely you have an obligation to do some things that are not commercial. That's the underlying justification for the licence fee.
I suspect there'll be a U-turn. The BBC are having to make quite a lot of handbrake turns because they had their funding cut by your friend, the former Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries. I think the BBC haven't got all those decisions right. I'm pretty confident there will be a U-turn on this. But to pick up briefly on Neil's point, I think there is a bit of a habit of the Conservative government picking fights with the BBC when it's under pressure on other topics, as it has been this week.
Thank you very much. Nadine is indeed a great friend of mine. We've always got on famously. Well, almost always. Thank you to both of my panellists for that. Coming up next, the mighty Mark Francois of Rayleigh and Wickford is here. Could he be the knight in shining armour for Britain's motorists? Find out after these messages from our sponsors.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation with me, Jacob Rees-Mogg. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Robert says, as a cost saving, the Beeb should keep the singers and move Lineker and Match of the Day to BBC Sport and make it a subscription rather than under the licence fee. Very good idea. Philip says, Jacob, which football team do you support? Well, the Old Etonian Football Association did win the FA Cup a couple of times in the late 19th century, and although I wasn't there, they had my full support. Hannah, it is disgraceful that the BBC singers are being axed when Gary Lineker is earning such an obscene salary. It is just another example of sport being chosen over the arts. As a singer myself, music is so important to so many people, this would be a huge loss. Well, Hannah, I think I absolutely agree with you. Thank you for that. Now, few men elicit the respect of Conservatives as much as my next guest, and he's on a mission to get Britain moving again, especially since the pandemic. As with all problems in our society, it seems, a slovenliness in our infrastructural repairs has become endemic. This has hit, perhaps worst of all, our beloved motorists, who are already faced with an unwinnable war waged by the lycra-clad, hairline-receding, bicycle-riding vegetarian councillors who we heard about earlier, particularly in Oxford. Never mind what I think, though. Vox populi, vox Dei. We asked the great people of Arnold in Nottinghamshire, do you think a war is being waged on the motorist? And the people of Arnold have spoken.
There certainly is in Nottingham. Nottingham is very anti-car.
Very difficult. I mean, nobody follows the driving rules anymore, so it's quite dangerous. You've got to have eyes everywhere, and also those scooters that's about on the roads, that's really difficult as well.
No, I don't think there's a war waged against drivers. I think in Nottingham city centre,
It's easier to get round now, you can't get through, but having said that, when I have driven, I don't know which way to go, but I mean, with the onset of the trams and good bus service and stuff like that, I think it's ideal for, you know, just people to walk without having to watch the roads all the time.
I'm going to get myself a dash cam. I never thought I would, but I think it's necessary now, because some of the people that drive today, I'm sure they haven't got driving licences anyway.
Well, I'm joined now by the man, the myth, the legend, actually a friend of mine, and bollard basher, Mark Francois. Mark, you've got a bill before Parliament. You're trying to make it easier for the motorist and to make sure that roadworks are cleared out earlier. How is it going to work?
Thank you, Jacob. Well, the bill, the Roadworks regulation bill, and I took the liberty of bringing a copy with me this evening, basically does three things. The first thing that it does is it tightens up on the granting of permits, because if you want to dig up the King's Highway, you need a permit from the Highways Authority. This would tighten up the conditions under which that can be granted, and it could make it easier for the Highways Authority to say no if the proposed roadworks would cause too much disruption. Secondly, it gives the Highways Authority a duty to try and coordinate the works better. So if you're digging up the road for one purpose, you try and get the other contractor in to do something else at the same time. And thirdly, it would increase the fines for operators who dig up the roads and overrun. And for persistent offenders, it would increase the fines to 10% of their annual corporate turnover, which would really hit them in the pocket, and that would make them sit up and take notice.
OK, but wasn't it made easier to dig up the road by Margaret Thatcher for the very good reason that utilities were being stopped from adding new services, and that we all want superfast fibre broadband, we want the water companies to stop sewage going into the rivers. We actually need the roads to be dug up to have these services delivered.
Well, look, you know, roadworks are a bane of modern life. One of the most, it's very frustrating to sit in a long queue of traffic, to inch forward, and that's not good for the environment. You finally get through the contraflow lights, and then you drive past a hole in the ground that's immaculately coned off with absolutely no one doing any work. How many of your viewers have had that experience time and again? So the point of this bill is it doesn't stop people digging up the roads when they have to, but it would make them do it quicker. And so if they say they're going to do it in a week and they overrun, they get hit financially very hard. So this would speed up that process in order to get the job done faster.
Well, to sound like a civil servant, hasn't this been tried before and not worked? Isn't this a slightly improved version of John Major's Cohen's hotline?
No, it's not. But that was a gimmick. The point about this, and I had a meeting with the Roads Minister, Richard Holden, 2 weeks ago, ably supported by two other Essex MPs, Vicky Ford and Anna Firth, and we were discussing this. He very kindly said after the meeting, about a day later, Mark Francois' bill hits the nail on the head. So he's looking at how it might be possible to take some of the things in this bill and implement them perhaps by government guidance from the DFT. So he was attracted to this idea. Now, one option that they're looking at is what's called lane rental, where on particularly sensitive roads, the ones that get dug up again and again, actually you make the contractor pay by the day to dig up the road. So in other words, they pay up front rather than overrun and get fined afterwards. And they've tried that in a number of county council and other areas. It's been quite successful. So Richard is looking at rolling that out across the country more widely and doing that, as it were, in sympathy with my bill.
And your very good point about coordinating work between utilities, because all of us have seen a road dug up by the Gas Board one week and by British Telecom the next week, when they could have cooperated and it would only have been closed for 1 week.
And that is completely maddening. So I've given the campaign a name. I've called it the Can the Cones campaign. Forgive me, there's the logo of a cone with a red line through it. So I am hoping, look, this is a 10-minute rule bill, so you understand procedurally, because of the tightness of parliamentary time, realistically, it's unlikely to get onto the statute book. But I'm trying to persuade government ministers, and Richard Holden's, given us a very fair hearing, to take some of the ideas in the bill and implement them via secondary legislation.
And are you effectively trying to win back something for the motorist who is being so pilloried at the moment with ULEZ charges, with 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. Everything seems to be anti the motorist at the moment, when in fact driving is one of our key freedoms.
It absolutely is. And, you know, Essex is just on the edge of the ULEZ zone. And I think, you know, Sadiq Khan has got this completely wrong. I think it could cost him the mayoral election next year. But let's see. Yes, our motorists are very heavily taxed for the privilege of driving their car, and they increasingly sit in long queues at roadworks because, as you say, one person digs up the road 1 week and 2 months later someone else is digging it up. So what I'm trying to do with this legislation is to make sure that when you have to dig the road up, and sometimes you do, particularly if it's an emergency, you do it as fast as possible. You don't leave the thing empty or unpopulated for a week or more. You get in, you do what you've got to do, you get out of the way and you get the traffic flowing.
And what do you do about councils who have responsibilities for roads but actually leave a lot of them in a pretty poor state of repair? Can you put pressure on them as well through this?
Yes, well, part of the problem is it comes down to negotiating the permit. And at the moment, it's all weighted in favour of the person that wants to dig the road up. A local highways authority can only really refuse a permit on grounds of safety, and even that is judicially reviewable. So when they come to negotiate, really all the power lies with the utility company. What this bill does is it resets that balance, and it allows the council, the highways authority, to refuse a permit outright if the plans are too disruptive. So at the end of the day, it's a negotiation, and what I'm trying to do is to strengthen the hand of the council on behalf of the motorists.
And do you think 24-hour working is part of the solution, or do you think that would annoy more residents than it would please because of the noise?
Well, I think that depends. If it's right in the middle of a heavily populated urban area, that might be unpopular, but at least you get the pain over quicker. If it's in a rural area where most people aren't going to be disturbed, you could argue there's a lot of upside and very little downside. I think what really frustrates people is the lack of a sense of urgency in all of this. And the other thing is, you know, DCMS are reluctant because they think it'll slow up the rollout of broadband. No, the reverse is true. If they have to do it quicker, you get your broadband faster.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm glad you're not being confused with John Major. That is very reassuring, because if you were John Major, all my political illusions would have been shattered. Thank you, Mark. Anyway, that's all from us. Up next is Dan Wootton. Mr. Wootton, what's in store in your box of tricks tonight?
Jacob, well, actually, inspired by you, we are discussing whether Boris Johnson should actually accept the results of this kangaroo court, if indeed the Privileges Committee does find him guilty, and would he actually go on to win a by-election as you predict he would? So we've got Boris backers versus the Boris haters tonight, Jacob.
Well, that sounds absolutely excellent. I think he would win a by-election if it happened by miles. That's all coming up after the weather, and you wouldn't want to miss that. As always, I expect the sun is shining in Somerset, even in the night time. But thank you to all my guests, and thank you for watching. We'll be back on Monday at 8 p.m. This has been State of the Nation, and you, dear viewers, have been Moggalicious.
Good evening, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office. Tomorrow will be pretty similar to today. Some sunshine, plenty of showers blown along by gusty winds, being created by a big area of low pressure out to the west. We do have this waving weather fronts covering the southeast through this evening, making for a pretty soggy end to Thursday. Outbreaks of rain slowly clearing away from East Anglia and the southeast, but lingering until around midnight across parts of Norfolk. Following on from that, you can see the low here and lots of showers piling in, certainly for Scotland, Northern Ireland, North Wales and North West England. Further south, it should become a little drier through the nights, not especially cold. We start Friday at 6s and 7s. We also should start with quite a bit of sunshine over the Midlands, Eastern England and parts of the south, but the showers will develop. Plenty of showers across southern Scotland early on, and you can see the showers breaking out by mid to late morning.
pretty extensively. So nowhere immune. Where we see the showers, they'll be heavy, perhaps even turn into thunderstorms. They should tend to zip through on a brisk breeze, and between the showers, bit of sunshine, seeing temperatures again climbing into the teens. The wind's a little lighter over central Scotland, which means the showers here could be quite slow moving. And through the evening, lots of showers packing into Northern Ireland. Pretty wet end to the day here, and that wetter weather sweeping into southern Scotland during the evening as well. And that leads into a showery day again on Saturday. Perhaps not as many showers across parts of the south, but a chance of seeing longer dry spells. And the far north also turning a little drier, but parts of southeast Scotland, northeast England, again seeing lots of showers through the day. Again, quite mild but quite windy in the south, but it's starting to turn a little colder. These northerly winds picking up across northern Scotland, bringing